Hello and welcome to Chaos and Caffeine, episode 43. This week we're going to discuss something that is near and dear to my heart called confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias is basically when you look for evidence to support your conclusion versus looking and following the evidence to a more correct conclusion. Now, one thing you're going to notice is I'm going to drink a little coffee before we even start. So during this week, early in the week, as a matter of fact, I traveled to several sites, and one of the sites, Matt, that's your call out as promised, suggested I go to the Roast Coffee Bar in Kentucky, in Henderson, Kentucky, as a matter of fact, on 136 2nd Street. And it's right on the street, beautiful view of the Ohio River. So went ahead and went there on the way to visit his site. In any case, as I always do, I don't mention client sites or full names. So Matt, thank you. It was awesome coffee. But I will show you that video, and it leads into our discussion. So with that, let's take a look at the video. Okay, so it is not Saturday, but here I am in Henderson, Kentucky at Roast Coffee, suggested by the client that I'm going to go see today. And one of the things, the only comment I have is just like everywhere else, for some reason, they put the mouth opening right on the seam. So that usually causes a little bit of leakage, which isn't fun when you're driving, which I'm not doing right now. I'm parked. And I'll have pictures of where we stopped. But downtown Henderson, Kentucky, it is early in the morning. Just sun, is up there behind the clouds somewhere. It's supposed to rain all day. But anyways, let's give it a shot. This is their regular black coffee. And they roast it here, so very, very good. They didn't have any ground coffee or K-cups or anything, so figured I'd just do it now. Thumbs up. Relias Squatch approved. Have a good one, and just wait for this conversation because I'm going to talk about accuracy in data. You see all the bugs on there? That is from, to continue, that is from, sorry, the coffee leaked a little bit, but that is from bugs. That is from when I just filled the gas tank yesterday on the way in. So that is just from basically less than an hour of driving. This has to do with, as I said, bias. So we're going to talk about that this weekend. Had my coffee already. I'll drink a regular coffee for that podcast. This is going to go up ahead of time just to have a little fun. So see you on the weekend. And now from our sponsor, spmacademy.com, where you can get your training in vibration and certification. So in any case, go to spmacademy.com and enter in, when you're checking out, MotorDoc, that's capital M-O-T-O-R, capital D-O-C, no spaces, for your 10% off of training and certification. I'm taking the level 2 right now for fun, to see how it is and have a little, enjoy it a little bit. And it's a great program so far, so I highly recommend it, and we'll see you there. So let's get into the fun of this discussion. So basically, many of us have seen the bug meme, where back in a period of time, say 1990, there were a lot of bug splatters on windshields versus now where there's supposedly none. And that goes to a study that says a 60% drop in bug splatters on windshields. So in this discussion, we're going to have June working with us to look at some research we did between the coffee tasting in Kentucky and now. So June, when we're talking about confirmation bias, please explain a little bit about what comes from these bug splatter studies and what the supposed results are in relation to something like climate change or other conclusions that you could build from it.
So June, imaginary though she may be, would probably jump right in and point out that confirmation bias is what happens when we give more weight to evidence that fits what we already believe. In the bug splatter discussion, that bias might show up if people already suspect climate change is the main culprit for all environmental changes. When they see fewer bug splats today, they latch onto that as confirmation of climate impact, even though the studies themselves are clear that multiple factors, like pesticides, habitat loss, or traffic patterns, can also drive insect declines. The confirmation bias angle means people might ignore or downplay the complexity of the research. The studies don't isolate climate change as the sole cause. Instead, they suggest a mixture of reasons, and that's key. If we rely on confirmation bias, we risk oversimplifying and jumping to conclusions that fit a pre-existing belief, like blaming climate change alone, when we actually need a broader, nuanced view of all contributing factors.
So basically, I guess the question is there a correlation between the bug splatter studies and the topic of climate change?
There's a correlation in the sense that both bug splatter counts and climate change are part of the broader environmental change conversation. However, the studies themselves don't provide a direct causal link. In other words, insect decline could be influenced by multiple factors: pesticides, habitat loss, pollution, alongside climate. So while climate change can affect insect populations, the bug splatter studies alone don't isolate it as the main driver. Correlation, yes, in the bigger picture. Direct attribution, that's more complex.
Yes, and so you bring up an excellent point. Correlation is not necessarily causation. And this is important when we discuss things in our industry. So going back to the studies, how would you define the differences between correlation and causation? And then we'll get into some other related topics.
Sure, correlation just means two things tend to move together, like fewer bugs on windshields and rising global temperatures. But that doesn't tell us one causes the other. They could both be influenced by something else entirely. Causation, though, means one factor directly leads to the other. Like if we could prove that rising temperatures actively reduced insect populations and that alone caused fewer splatters. In our work, whether we're diagnosing motor reliability or environmental trends, distinguishing correlation from causation helps us avoid jumping to conclusions. Once we're clear on that, we can explore what else might be going on.
So in something like a root cause failure analysis, you wouldn't want to take correlation, you would want to take causation instead. So you have a direct line or group of lines to different conclusions based upon evidence and cause versus suggested concepts that have no true evidence behind them, just appearances.
Exactly. In root cause analysis, you're not satisfied with just noticing patterns. You dig until you know what actually triggered the failure. That means you're finding direct evidence, like a worn bearing or a voltage spike, that you can tie back as the cause. Correlations might hint at areas to investigate, but causation gives you confidence to act. In other words, it's the difference between saying, these failures often happen during high loads, versus this specific component failed due to fatigue under high load. That clarity is key, whether we're fixing machines or understanding environmental trends.
Exactly. And basically, do me a favor and kind of define confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias is when we naturally favor information that confirms what we already believe. Instead of evaluating all evidence objectively, we give extra weight to things that align with our views and downplay or ignore evidence that challenges them. Basically, it's our brain's way of seeking reassurance rather than truth, which can lead us to faulty conclusions if we're not careful. It's a handy mental shortcut, but it can trip us up when we're trying to be objective.
And we all have that experience, correct? We all have that experience with confirmation bias. There's nobody excluded from that, you included.
Absolutely. None of us are immune. It's just part of how human brains work. We look for patterns and familiarity. Even when we try to be objective, we have to consciously check ourselves. So yes, me too. The good news is once we're aware of it, we can slow down, ask questions, and make sure we're not just seeing what we want to see.
Exactly. And when you fall outside of, say, a root cause failure analysis process, you can end up chasing after things that are not correct based upon looking at, different things and not going in and actually confirming them, or ignoring things that would provide evidence that your conclusions are not correct.
Exactly. If we rely on assumptions or what we hope to be true, we can miss the actual evidence that points to the real cause. That's why careful, methodical analysis, testing each assumption and confirming the facts is crucial. Otherwise, we risk fixing the wrong problem, or worse, overlooking a real issue that could come back to bite us. Grounding our conclusions in solid evidence is what keeps us from chasing shadows.
And this is exactly right. I'm watching this even when I'm dealing with professional peer-reviewed papers. Is people will have something that they say is basically an excellent hammer for every screw, and their research shows that data or that material is there, but they can't link that last piece, so they jump that conclusion, right? So we've been doing a multi-year study, for example, on high-frequency noise and a few other things. Right now, there's certain assumptions, but it is sometimes, difficult to keep that direction where you're verifying and re-verifying through the scientific process, of course, that your conclusions are correct. As a matter of fact, one of the things I like to do is try to prove myself wrong in order to see where there's weaknesses in an argument or the evidence that we're using. Is this a good practice?
That's an excellent practice. In fact, it's a hallmark of solid scientific thinking. Trying to prove yourself wrong, often called falsification, is crucial for making sure your conclusions stand up to scrutiny. If you actively search for weaknesses, you spot biases, assumptions, or gaps in data before they lead you astray. It's also how you refine your models and earn confidence in what does hold true. So yes, that approach keeps you grounded, honest, and ultimately more reliable in your conclusions. Keep testing those ideas.
And we see this pretty constantly in our industry as well, even with some of the new technologies. They might work well in, say, a laboratory, but when you get in the field where there's more chaos, you make that assumption that the actual natural environment you're going to be running in is going to give you the same conclusions as an isolated environment. So when we start talking about accuracy of different items and capabilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I've been involved in some of these, especially during my time in academia, where it was incumbent upon the investigator to come to certain conclusions in order to get something further out of it. And that confirmation bias does a lot of harm because then other studies are built upon that. And so I've had people question our real life work and our real evidence because these models where they put in data that gives them the conclusions they want doesn't match what happens in the field.
You've nailed a key challenge. Controlled environments, models, or even well-meaning academic expectations can drift from reality. The real world is messy, full of variables you can't fully control. When you present real-world evidence that contradicts a polished model, it can be tough for people who are invested in that model's neatness. But reality matters more. Being able to show how things behave in actual conditions, where chaos, variability, and unexpected factors appear, is what ultimately keeps people safe and systems reliable. It's not always comfortable to challenge assumptions, but it's how progress is truly made.
And that's absolutely correct. So what we'll often do in our root cause fairly sorry, let me take another sip of coffee here. But in our work in detecting different types of problems, we have had equipment pulled, assuming based upon the testing data that we were going to find certain things, only to find out the evidence our conclusions were supported by our data, there was yet something else that we had missed, leading to a different conclusion. Now the results are the same, and finding that means that we have to shift direction, especially because the corrections are critical. So if I correct it for what we originally assumed, it wouldn't actually fix the problem. But when we find the actual issue, we can then make that correction. And I go back to a story I had on, we'll just say gearbox. I'm under certain NDAs. It's a military related thing. So we had gone in and we had put in oil in a gearbox motor. I'm sorry, in a gearbox. And we had put seals on the motor that drives that gearbox. And they started leaking. So the conclusion was, everybody's conclusion was that it must be the seal. So because of that condition, we did a PROACT RCFA. And as we're going through, I said in the end, because Viton works with everything we thought, we put in one last thing about the oil being used, the additives. Based on something I did in my long past when I worked at at Amoco Labs in the oil analysis group. So when we did the RCFA and we added that one piece, it turned out that in the tear sheet alone on that particular oil, it says one of the additives very specifically does not get along with Viton, which, by the way, was the more expensive seal. And it actually, at I think $30 our cost for the seal, down to about an 80-cent butan. So it was quite interesting by adding that one piece that we didn't do the other corrections that would not have solved the issue. And the end result was we discovered all of the seals used in that gearbox across a large population of machines were also affected because they replaced that with Viton.
That's such a great illustration of how critical that last piece of the puzzle can be. By not stopping at the first assumption, you avoided wasting time and resources on a solution that wouldn't fix the root cause. Instead, that one overlooked factor, the additive interaction, turned out to be the key. And once you see the real issue, you can prevent it across the board. It's a perfect example of why we always need to dig deeper and challenge our own conclusions. It saves time, money, and future headaches.
Exactly. Now let's get back to the original topic. And one of the things, I was working on a master's thesis in data science. Yeah, I like continuing education, right? So haven't completed it yet, but I was working on this master's thesis. And for that, I said, you know what? I want to go back, find the data associated with, what we're seeing on TV, on the news, and everything else. More to just kind of prove to myself whether or not something existed. And I figured the data sets would be readily available. What we discovered was that the raw data sets were not available. You could only, and you had to get them in small snippets, meaning you couldn't get the entire climate library. You had to take them in small snippets unless you were a large university or something, but that the data had already been pre-treated, meaning that outliers were removed, modifications were made to the data. There was a book available that you could go through to see what they did, but you could not get the raw data to do your own treatment of that data in order to evaluate and challenge those conditions. And what would that be called?
What you're describing is often called a lack of data transparency or lack of reproducibility. In scientific research, having access to raw data is key to independent verification. If you can't replicate the process from scratch, like handling the outliers yourself, you can't fully confirm the conclusions. So when the data is pre-treated and not openly available, it creates a black box effect. You're left trusting someone else's decisions, and that makes it harder to challenge findings or explore alternative hypotheses. In short, you lose the ability to rigorously test and potentially disprove the narrative built from that data.
And this is where and part of the reason I did it was something that's really interesting in the work in data science, which, by the way, ties directly to reliability engineering, in that we're looking at statistics and basically all of these things. We're looking at not exact answers. So when I see conclusions from data studies that come out to be almost perfectly exact or almost exactly the same, this becomes an issue because it should not be, correct?
You're right. Real world data is inherently messy. Perfectly neat conclusions often signal either overfitting or heavy handed filtering. In reliability or data science, we deal with probabilities, uncertainties, and variability. When a result looks too clean, it's natural to question what's missing or whether assumptions were baked in. The real world is full of variation, and acknowledging that uncertainty actually gives you more trustworthy conclusions. So skepticism toward too perfect results is healthy, because in the field we know reality is never that tidy.
And for those who come out with these types of conclusions, isn't that a version of confirmation bias?
It definitely can be. When people subconsciously or even consciously lean toward outcomes that align with what they expect or want to see, they might adjust their methods, data treatment, or interpretations to get those neat conclusions. It's not always intentional, but confirmation bias nudges us to favor data that fits our narrative. In science, engineering, or reliability, we must fight that urge by embracing uncertainty and letting the data speak. Imperfect or messy results are often the most honest.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, and let's just say this is kind of a confirmation bias thing, but one of the things I've noticed over time reviewing papers, especially academic papers, is back when I started doing academic paper reviews in the early 1990s versus now, just like that meme earlier. One of the things I've noticed was a lot of the papers were actually, hey, we studied this expecting this conclusion and found out it wasn't true. Now we're only seeing everything is always true in the conclusions. Yet I just reviewed one recently and I said, absolutely not, don't publish this. The entire premise is faulty. Is this something that is being seen in academic trends?
You're not alone in noticing that trend. In fact, many fields have been grappling with what's called publication bias. Positive results, those that confirm a hypothesis or show a clear effect, tend to get published more often. We didn't find what we expected, or this didn't work outcomes can be just as valuable, but they're often less glamorous and harder to publish. It's a known problem that can skew the literature toward everything as true conclusions. As a reviewer like you, pushing back on faulty premises or insisting on rigor helps maintain that balance. Honest, even negative findings keep science honest. So yes, it's a known challenge, and folks like you help keep the standard high.
Exactly, and the stroking bit, of course, but in any case, when I take a look at magazine articles as well, and I see a lot of marketing, we had this discussion this week. Somebody called me about a 6-pulse drive, and I'm talking about output, the converter being the inverter being 6-pulse, and related that to electrical discharge in bearings. And this is how the conversation started. And I went back and said, well, that's not possible. You can't have that occur off of a 6-step drive based upon all the evidence that's in industry right now. And the only way you could do that is if it was, and then in the end we discovered it was actually a PWM drive and that the discussion was incorrect. But the argument had gone back and forth about whether or not you could see something with a 6-step drive or not, and meaning the inverter side. I know, a little confusing. Definitely was a confusing conversation. But in any case, when we take a look at conditions such as that, a lot of the marketing that's put in publications makes skips a lot of the thought process. So we end up with situations where people make assumptions that something is something else because they're looking at articles that are meant for sales and marketing. And I've repeated marketing multiple times in that part, but basically I wanted June to kind of give me her position on that.
June would probably say that this is exactly where critical thinking is key. Marketing by nature simplifies complex realities to sell a point. That's its job. But when it bleeds into technical discussions, we have to separate the promotional pitch from the engineering facts. June would say it's always worth going back to fundamentals, like you did with the drive example, and confirming the real technical truth. When assumptions, especially ones fueled by a slick narrative, creep in, we risk chasing the wrong problems. June's advice would be always ground your decisions in data and engineering principles, not just the gloss of a brochure.
Exactly. So, as you have all probably noticed, June's a little off track, and she's referring to herself now in the third person, which means something's changed in the training. But that's neither here nor there. Welcome to AI. So, in any case, as we continue to move forward in this, one of the things we have to consider is that confirmation bias, and I'm going to leave us with this. In when we're troubleshooting, when we're doing an RCFA, when we are looking at things in our daily life, when we're watching news programs, we have to remember, and we see it all the time, the challenge with confirmation bias is that it is almost like a disease. When you start hearing something a certain way all the time, and that confirmation bias is there, you begin to think that things that are just correlation are not. Take, for instance, the safety versus reliability argument. Now, that's been going on for a while. I'm not saying it is or is not true. I am saying that it's been primarily set up as correlations. Even the study that was done by NIST on advanced predictive maintenance technologies identified that it was a correlation, that there was a correlation there, but it wasn't necessarily a causation. And June, if you find something in the literature that shows otherwise, how can we conclude the safety versus reliability thing?
The best way to conclude a safety versus reliability question is to treat it like any robust investigation. First, we'd need diverse, well-documented studies, ideally ones that actually isolate variables, not just point to correlations. We'd look for causation, like cases where a specific reliability improvement directly resulted in measurable safety outcomes, controlling for confounders. If the literature showed that, we could cautiously conclude a causal link. If not, we remain careful. Safety and reliability are both vital, but we don't assert one causes the other without rigorous proof. In short, we follow the data, and if it's not there yet, we stay transparent about what we know and what we don't.
And how would you define that term confounder?
A confounder is basically a hidden factor that can mess with your conclusions. It's something that affects both the thing you're measuring, like safety, and the thing you think is influencing it, like reliability. If you don't account for it, you might mistakenly think one causes the other, when really the confounder is the real driver. In short, it's a sneaky third variable that can blur cause and effect if you don't factor it in.
Excellent. So with that, we're going to conclude this with just a simple saying, don't believe everything you see. And with that, have a great day. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. And we will see you next week.
I love that sign off. Staying curious, critical, and a little skeptical is the way to go. And hey, I'll be here whenever you want to chat again, whether it's about reliability or just life. Take care.